Most legends start with a body count, a crime scene, or a moment of violence that forces the world to pay attention. This one started with optimism, enough optimism to build a palace in the Rockies. But the thing that turned this place into a nocturnal monument wasn't tragedy at all. It was contradiction. A building humming with rumors, long before rumors were profitable. This is the story of a mountain hotel that inspired fear without evidence, investigators without conclusions, sightings without witnesses agreeing on details, and an author who found fiction easier to write than explanations easier to prove. This is the Stanley House, not the myth version, not the Hollywood reinterpretation, the real building, the real timeline, and the real pressure it left on the people who stayed there. And I'm your host, Mr. Bones, and you're listening to The Nighttale Show. To understand the Stanley, you have to understand the man who built it. Freeland Oscar Stanley was not a spiritualist. He was not interested in ghosts. He was not chasing mythology. He was chasing oxygen. From Newton to the West, born in 1849 in Newton, Massachusetts, Stanley was a violinist by training, a photographer by early trade, and eventually a self-made entrepreneur who would shape transportation history. He and his identical twin brother Francis Stanley entered the photography business together and became well-respected innovators under the Stanley Dry Plate company name, one of the earliest dry photographic producers in the country. It was profitable, so profitable that the brothers sold the business in 1904 to George Eastman's company, Kodak. Flush with capital and restless with curiosity, Stanley pivoted to the next thing that excited him, which was machines that made steam look like a future fuel source. Freeland and Francis founded the Stanley Motor Carriage Company, producing one of the earliest consumer automobiles powered by steam. The Stanley steamer would later become an industrial icon, quiet compared to gas engines, powerful for its time, temperamental like most early engineering, but respected as innovation, not spectacle. And then, the reason for it all. In 1903, Stanley was diagnosed with tuberculosis. Now, this diagnosis is the thread that moves everything west. His doctor recommended he relocate to a drier, high-altitude climate, so Stanley headed for Colorado, not for invention, but for breath. Now, Estes Park was a mountain paradise, but not yet for a tourism empire. It was small, a village really packed only seasonally with hunters, ranchers, carpenters, and a handful of hotels that all lacked scale and luxury. The air changed Stanley. Literally, he spent one summer in Estes Park and reported significant improvement in his symptoms. The climate that healed his lungs also ignited his entrepreneurial instinct, and before long, Stanley began buying land in the valley, commissioning roads, and viewing Estes Park not as a recovery site, but as a future destination for healing-minded luxury travelers. A man saved by the outdoors builds his monuments outdoors, and this monument would be called the Stanley. Construction began in 1907. Stanley hired local workers, many locals from the county and neighboring states, acting as a hands-on construction manager. Not a ceremonial one, he oversaw everything personally. The architectural plans, the electrical plant, the plumbing systems, the heating designs, the staff hiring. He even built the infrastructure to welcome the future. Stanley engineered a hydroelectric plant along the Fall River specifically to electrify the hotel. Now, this wasn't a minor innovation. This was experimental, large-scale rural electrification. And the plant powered the building years before rural electrification became normalized in America. So the lights flickered, lines thumped, pipes hummed. Pressure rose and dropped in walls, responding to temperature and voltage shifts. That early electricity myth is so important not because it proves ghosts exist, but because early electricity makes people invent ghosts without meaning to. The Stanley Hotel opened on July 4th, 1909, a celebration of industry, recovery, tourism, and high-altitude optimism. The newspaper headline wasn't eerie then. It was celebratory. The building was marketed as a luxurious retreat, not a haunting hub. 140 rooms, long hardwood hallways, servant bells, staff housed privately on the ground floor, horse stables nearby, concerts in the grand ballroom, summer breezes cooling open window lines up the mountain. Everything was electrical, everything was modern for 1909, and everything was optimistic. The Stanley Hotel was optimistic, but the Stanley? The Stanley didn't want to stay optimistic forever. Most hotels have floor plans. The Stanley had personality. It sprawled like a hollow palace, acoustically wild, physically open, seasonally isolated. Hallways were long enough for sounds to travel unreliably, wings sectioned into strange microclimates, and staff corridors not publicly accessible. Multiple renovations later adding corridors that made it feel like the building itself was misplacing. It had 4 floors, 2 wings, one main public entrance, one freight elevator behind the staff corridor, dozens of maintenance paths used historically for luggage and staff, a grand staircase known for acoustics, winter closures that isolated entire sections accidentally. This environment becomes the seedbed for contradictory recollection, because when you hear a story of footsteps in an empty building, you begin inventing suspects without names. When electricity snaps on a mountain line, you assume agency without evidence. Contradiction is fertile soil for folklore, and the Stanley was built on fertile soil, literally and narratively. But folklore wasn't profitable yet, not until someone else checked into room 217. Here's where the myth begins evolving. Room 217 didn't earn its reputation on crime, but it earns its legend on interference. Stanley opened into applause in 1909, but applause begins to fade, and what lingers are the moments that disturb routine. And by 1910, staff and guests weren't reporting a haunting, they were reporting anomalies. The kind of anomalies newspapers once used for industrial accidents, train derailments, or missing persons notices. Except here, the missing person was consistency itself. One of the earliest published mentions came from the local press in 1910 describing a cashier who swore someone rang a service bell in an empty corridor. The bell system, built by Stanley for convenience, was one of the most modern guest service integrations in rural Colorado at the time. But now, it was ringing when nobody touched it. The phrasing in these early reports is always the same. And I quote, "I thought I saw someone. I assumed it was the wind. I can't explain it. It was probably nothing. That probably nothing is how folklore fertilizes itself." Hardwood floors run the full length of the hotel, and long corridors allowed sound to travel farther than expected. Engineers who later analyzed the architecture noted that this temperature shifts, especially in early spring and late fall, caused the wood to expand and contract violently enough to imitate footsteps or popping sounds. This wasn't a ghost story, it was a physics story, but the physics behaved like a rumor generator. Unpredictable, uncontrolled, unprovable by memory alone. It's the paradox of storytelling. When something has a natural cause but unreliable behavior, a supernatural explanation gets glued to the experience anyway because it feels alive. Housekeepers in the 1910s talked about a thin, tall man in what they described as early 1900s gentleman's clothing. They would think he was a guest, walk toward him, blink, and suddenly he was gone. No introductions, no police contact, and no identity recorded. Just a shape that dissolved before you got close. Not a ghost, a recurring blind eyewitness event. The building was not killing people, it was misplacing explanation, and misplaced explanation starts to look like intent. In 1926, the hotel installed a modernized fire suppression system to match updated safety guidelines. But ironically, these systems, primitive by today's standards, were experimental then and a frequent cause of pressure anomalies in walls. Fire inspectors recorded infrastructure irregularities during installation drafts, but those were maintenance issues, not paranormal ones. And yet, people now call these same areas the haunted wings decades before ghost hunters made them profitable as tours. Again, folklore grows not from proof, but from contradiction delivered repeatedly. By the 1930s, the rumor cycle had begun to circulate at community bonfires, taverns, hunting roundup spots, and local lodge meetings. The stories begin sounding eerier. A boy bouncing a ball on the 4th floor, but no boy was booked there. The ballroom piano sometimes playing a melody, but no pianist was scheduled. Sudden cold pockets forming near the staircase, but winter windows were closed. Housekeepers seeing figures in empty wings. Era still produced no police case, no autopsy, no suspect list, no crime scene. A legend needs a villain. The Stanley didn't give one, which makes the Stanley irresistible to crime narrators like us, because in true crime, the scariest file is the one marked. In 1960, Senator John F. Kennedy stayed at the hotel during a Colorado campaign stop. His visits fueled the hotel's prestige, not its unease. He joked with staff, drank coffee in the lobby, and admired the mountains, and he departed without incident. No public statement exists that he felt anything paranormal. In fact, historical interviews suggest the building didn't scare influential guests at all. It scared the people who lived alone in its surface corridors at night. Presidents don't talk much about ghosts. Buildings do, through people who lose arguments with disbelief. Room 217 had already begun to build reputation, but nothing had turned cinematic yet. Not until King walked into the lobby. Writer Stephen King stayed in 1974 while researching what would become The Shining. And that night, in isolation, he dreamed of a fire hose roaring through the hallways, which the building didn't even have pressure for until decades later. He later said the isolation of the building made the dream feel plausible. But in documentary terms, we note the truth. The Stanley's legend exploded not because of a supernatural crime, but because a novelist glued metaphor onto its blind spots. The book was published in 1977 and later adapted into film, cementing the myth. But even before the novel came out, staff members noticed public perception twists. Guests would joke less in the hallways. Reviews referenced feeling watched, and others imagined presences where machinery hubbed. Caretakers debated their sanity rather than a suspect list. This is the part that matters most for the Night Tale show. The moment stories began outgrowing the man who built the hotel. By 1985, shows like Travel Channel revisited the building later, analyzing acoustic anomalies, cold pockets, and flickering lines from primitive electricity, and the psychological effect of isolation. No forensics ever confirmed a crime, but travelers confirmed contradictions, and contradictions outlast evidence because evidence decays. The Stanley began as a health retreat. It became a folklore capital through repeated contradictory reports. It hosted influential guests without incident. Its legend grew in silence and board logs, not police reports. The most enduring scare was never fear, it was confusion. And next we map why confusion may matter more than terror at shaping a place. Every legend reaches a point where it becomes self-sustaining. For the Stanley, that point arrived in the late 1980s. This era wasn't defined by big moments, but by thousands of small ones stacked on each other until gravity took effect. Guests weren't reporting terror, they were reporting interference. A husband hearing someone walk overhead when no room was rented above him. A woman feeling a tap on her shoulder while brushing her teeth, only to find no one there. A child saying, "The lady tucked me in," late at night, in a wing where no housekeeper was assigned. None of these accounts came with threats. None came with violence. All came with a strange tone. I know what I felt, but I don't know what's true. And once a place becomes a container for uncertainty, it becomes irresistible. You could argue the Stanley didn't become unsettling because of what people experienced, but because of how the building invites misinterpretation. The long hallways destroy spatial logic, and from end to end, some floors stretch nearly the length of a football field. A sound made at one end can appear to come from the other, and in low occupancy seasons, a single guest can feel like the last survivor of a forgotten world. There was also the wood expansion problem. Hardwood flooring is alive, and in cold nights, boards contract with sudden cracking. In warm midday, they expand and groan, shifting, releasing trapped air pockets. A quiet hotel becomes a percussion instrument. Renovations also rewrote the building. The Stanley had undergone dozens of renovations since 1909. Walls were added, corridors removed, sealed doors, open windows, maintenance tunnels repurposed. A guest can walk down a hallway and sense the walls getting wider or narrower without obvious reason. All of this creates the illusion of intention, when in reality, it's just the evolution of a century-old structure. But the mind doesn't ask for architectural lessons, it fills in the blanks with narrative. The most credible reports in the hotel's history doesn't come from tourists chasing thrills, they come from people who worked there, particularly the housekeepers who walked those halls daily. They were the first to say, "Someone brushed past me. I heard humming. A door closed on its own. I saw someone walking, but the hallway was empty. These weren't anonymous internet posts or scripted anecdotes. These were employment statements shared quietly among staff long before paranormal tourism became profitable. Housekeepers talked about a woman in period dress, not floating or glowing, not threatening or violent, just there, like a guest from 1909 who never checked out. They talked about clothes being folded after they had turned their backs. They talked about a faint scent of roses in hallways where no flowers were kept. They talked about lights turning off and on, not in flickers, but in decisive clicks. And like all folklore, the stories were simple. Simple stories endure. Every legend eventually condenses into a symbol. For this hotel, that symbol is room 217. Its fame didn't come from a murder, a suicide, or a documented haunting. It came from a dream, a fever dream experienced by a writer in 1974. A dream that became one of the most iconic novels in American horror history. But long before guests filled the room with imagined terrors, the room already had a history. It suffered a gas explosion in 1911 during a severe storm. A housekeeper was injured but survived. Repairs were done quickly and the room returned to service. After that, several guests, over decades, reported odd sensations, pressure in the chest, or someone entering while I slept. Nothing violent, nothing traceable, just residual confusion. And confusion becomes myth when a best-selling author ties a fictional world to a real place. Room 217 became the most requested hotel room in Colorado, not because of what happened, but because of what people believe might happen. And that's the power of narrative. While guests romanticize the grand staircase and upper floors, employees know the true heart of the hotel lies underground. The service corridors beneath the building were originally carved for food storage, laundry transport, maintenance pipes, furnace access, employee movement unseen by guests. Now, these tunnels, they have uneven temperatures, whispering drafts, old piping systems, expanses of darkness, echoes that ricochet unpredictably, and many employees refuse to walk them alone at night. Not because they believe in ghosts, but because the space behaves as if it's watching itself. A century of infrastructure leaves psychological fingerprints. When people say they feel something in the basement, they're likely feeling isolation, temperature shifts, spatial distortion, fight or flight instinct. But once enough people feel it, the building stops needing explanations. The story fills itself in. One of the most reported events in the Stanley is the so-called shoulder tap. Guests claim, "I felt someone tap me from behind. I turned around and no one was there." This is a documented phenomenon that appears across hundreds of buildings globally: old hotels, historic homes, long corridors. Scientific explanations include rapid muscle contraction near the scapula nerve firing caused by temperature drop, clothing shifting, drafts hitting one point of the skin. But in the Stanley, this explanation rarely satisfies the witness because the tap doesn't feel random. It feels intentional. It feels gentle. It feels like a reminder. It feels like someone is saying, "You're not alone." Whether that person or someone exists is not the point. The experience does. Experiences build folklore faster than facts tear it down. In the 1990s, as paranormal investigation became mainstream, the Stanley emerged as one of the most documented active hotels in America. Not because it had a violent history, but because it had a cooperative one. Ghost hunters, historians, skeptics, journalists all came with equipment, notebooks, and theories. None found definitive proof, but all left with stories. Visitors described seeing figures in photographs that weren't visible in person, and hearing footsteps pacing outside their doors, having items disappear and reappear in opposite corners of their rooms, feeling watched in empty stairwells. But most importantly, almost every witness described the events as subtle and non-threatening. The Stanley did not scare people into running. It unsettled them into remembering. And remembered stories accumulate into legend. What separates the Stanley from most haunted hotels is that it doesn't impose a narrative. It reflects one. Guests walk in expecting something. The building offers small moments that confirm nothing and deny nothing. And people interpret the difference. If you expect a ghost, a door closing becomes a message. If you expect skepticism, a draft becomes physics. The Stanley House doesn't tell a story. It hosts the story you bring with you. That's what makes it powerful, and that's what makes it lasting. And that's why we're here. Not because the building is haunted, but because the building is a stage for human imagination under pressure. There's a misconception in paranormal folklore that fear comes from what's seen, but fear actually comes from interpretation, the brain's process of stitching meaning into ambiguity. And ambiguity is the Stanley's greatest architectural achievement. In the building report, waking up convinced someone was standing at the foot of the bed, hearing soft conversation in hallways that are physically empty, sensing a figure passing by them in a locked room, feeling certain they're being observed, though no eyes are present. These are not supernatural events. These are cognitive disruptions that occur when a space quietly defies the expectations of the human brain. The Stanley's long hallways, reflective surfaces, and unpredictable acoustics, shifting temperatures, and seasonal emptiness all conspire to make the mind work harder than usual. And when the mind works harder in silence, it invents company. This is not a flaw in human psychology, it's a survival mechanism. We evolved to anticipate danger. We evolved to detect movement. We evolved to create patterns where none exist. The Stanley House doesn't haunt people, it activates them. Paranormal researchers have tried for decades to categorize the Stanley's phenomena. Skeptics have tried equally hard to dismantle them. What's fascinating is that neither group has succeeded. Scientific explanations cover electromagnetic fluctuations, atmospheric pressure drops, infrared sound, old electrical wiring, wood expansion popping, suggestibility in isolated environments, sleep paralysis. All are plausible, all are rational, all fit a portion of the puzzle, but none make the puzzle disappear completely. On the other side, paranormal enthusiasts point to consistent witness descriptions, geographic energy theories, environmental resonance, apparitional memory, repetition of centuries-long storytelling patterns, cultural imprint, psychic suggestion. None of these are provable, none are disprovable, and that paradox creates a third category of truth. The experiences are real, even if the cause is unknown. Humans are binary machines living in a non-binary world. We want events to either be science or supernatural. The Stanley House refuses to pick. It thrives in the scene between the two. By the 2000s, the Stanley was no longer a building. It was a cultural symbol. Movie studios referenced it. Authors framed it in introductions of their own works. Investigators recorded episodes there. Online communities documented stories from guests spanning decades. Every time a new generation visited, the myth expanded. Not because they saw something new, but because the building delivered just enough anomaly to keep the story alive. You could say the building reinvented itself decade after decade. But a better truth is this: people reinvented themselves inside of it. Some tourists arrived hoping to be frightened. Some arrived hoping to be healed. Some arrived hoping to find meaning in the thin air of the Rockies. Almost all left with a story, and a legend is nothing more than stories with momentum. America is filled with old hotels. Some are older, larger, grander, more violent, and more historically significant. Yet none hold the same mythological grip as the Stanley. Why is that? Well, Estes Park is surrounded by mountains, making the hotel feel separate from the rest of the world. Its symmetry creates a mental tension, be beautiful and disorienting. It rose during the Industrial Revolution, the tuberculosis epidemic, and the early modernization of electricity, all periods of human uncertainty. Thousands of guests, workers, writers, and investigators contributed small, conflicting pieces to a larger puzzle. A writer with a vivid imagination connected the story of the hotel that would become a global phenomenon. But above all, the Stanley House doesn't provide enough evidence to confirm anything, just enough to deny nothing. It lives in the space between, and nothing haunts like the space between. When guests stay at the Stanley House today, experience is a curated blend of historical tours, paranormal storytelling, untouched hallways, renovated wings, quiet rooms, echoes of architectural imperfection, the power of suggestion. Some leave believing the hotel is active with spirits. Some leave believing every event can be explained by physics. Some leave believing both things at once. And that third category, the people who feel two realities at once, are the reason this legend will last another century. It's not about ghosts. It's not about fear. It's about the human brain confronting uncertainty inside a building designed for luxury that accidentally became a temple of ambiguity. True crime is built on motive, opportunity, evidence, victims, perpetrators. The Stanley House has none of these. What it has is something rarer: events without resolution, memories without reliability, stories without ownership. And stories like that live longer than any crime file ever could. Before we close, I want you to imagine this. It's early morning in Estes Park. The mountains are still dark. Mist curls off the peaks. The Stanley House stands alone against the rising sun. You walk inside. It's silent. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of potential. The air feels heavier than the altitude explains. The hallway in front of you stretches too long. A single doorway flickers with shifting light. You swear someone just turned around the corner. You swear you heard footsteps behind you. You swear you're alone. And maybe you are. Or maybe the building is nudging you the same way it nudged thousands before you. Not towards fear, but toward awareness. Awareness that you are standing in a place where explanation and imagination shake hands, where architecture redefines perception, where isolation whispers, where expectation alters experience, where stories are born without anyone writing them down. The Stanley House became legend not because of what happened there, but because of what might happen there. The possibilities haunt longer than proof. I'm Mr. Bones, and this has been The Night Tale Show. Until next time, watch the corners and trust what you feel, even if you can't explain it. Have a good night.